was 3 steps into the courtroom when my mother rolled her eyes, an exaggerated, theatrical sweep that said I was the problem again. The gallery rustled. Whispers slid across the benches like paper. I kept moving. Navy suit, steady breath, chin level. The bailiff called the case. My name, Rowan Blake, rang out, and beside it, the people who used to be my parents. "Good morning," Judge Brennan said, settling onto the bench. He glanced down at the file, then up at me. The change happened fast, eyebrows lifting, pupils narrowing, memory clicking into place. Recognition rolled across his face like a tide. "Counsel," he said to the room, but his gaze stayed on me. "Ms. Blake, would you approach for a moment?" I stepped forward. My mother's attorney, all silk tie and sympathetic frown, leaned toward her. She nodded without looking at me. That was Diane's way. Never look long enough to see what was real. At sidebar, Judge Brennan lowered his voice. "Rowan Blake." He said it not as a question, but as a recollection. "You're William Parker's granddaughter." "My grandfather. Yes, Your Honor." He inhaled, the smallest smile folding into something solemn. "I clerked for him 23 years ago." I let the silence hold, respect offered in a heartbeat. "He spoke of his clerks often," I said. "He admired yours, sir." The judge's gaze swung to opposing counsel. "Disclosure for the record, I clerked for the decedent when I was a young attorney. I did not socialize with the family. If either party believes this affects my impartiality, raise your objection now." My mother's lawyer hesitated, calculating optics against advantage. He whispered. Diane's mouth tightened. Scott stared past everyone at the clock, like this was a layover he hadn't planned. "No objection, Your Honor," the lawyer said finally. "Very well," Judge Brennan replied. He straightened, and the courtroom reassembled around us, sound swelling back in as though someone had unmuted the day. We returned to counsel table. I placed my pen parallel to the legal pad, the small ritual that kept my hands from shaking. Across the aisle, Diane had claimed a widow's posture in a black dress she'd never wear outside a performance. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue she'd brought just for the role. "Calling Morrison vs. Blake," the clerk read. "Petition to set aside will for undue influence and lack of capacity." The words drifted over the room like cold air. I traced them in my mind, let them dissolve. Allegations, not facts. "Opening statements?" Judge Brennan prompted. My mother's attorney stood first. He was good, the kind who laces fiction so tightly to feeling that juries forget to check the knots. "This is a case," he began, "about blood, grief, and a granddaughter who inserted herself between a father and his child." I stared at the grain of the counsel table and counted 4 slow breaths. When you've spent a lifetime being framed as the problem, you learn the rhythm. Their story first, your truth second. Let the storm pass. Anchor to the facts. He painted Diane as devoted and excluded, me as calculating and convenient. He lingered on the word granddaughter, like it lowered the moral ceiling of what love could be. When he sat, the room seemed to tilt back to level. I rose. "Your Honor," I said, voice steady, "this is a case about presence. Who showed up and who didn't?" I didn't look at Diane. I looked at the bench, at the man who'd learned the law beside my grandfather, who knew what showing up meant even when it cost you. In the quiet that followed, I felt the courtroom reset around a different center of gravity. "Proceed, Ms. Blake," Judge Brennan said, and just like that, we began. When people asked about my childhood, I used to lie. "Oh, my parents traveled a lot," I'd say. Or, "They were busy with work." It sounded cleaner than the truth, that Diane and Scott Blake dropped their 3-month-old daughter at her parents' doorstep and disappeared into their own. Freedom, my earliest memory isn't of them. It's of my grandmother, Helen Parker, humming softly while folding laundry, and my grandfather, Justice William Parker, coming home in his black judicial robe, smelling faintly of coffee and paper. They weren't supposed to be raising a baby at 55. But they did it anyway, without complaint, without conditions. My parents, meanwhile, were the embodiment of selfish ambition. Diane had been a debutante-turned-aspiring fashion buyer. Motherhood didn't match the aesthetic. I was too young, she always said, like that excused a lifetime of absence. My father, Scott, was a professional hockey player chasing endorsements and groupies across North America. The tabloids called them the golden couple. They were too busy being beautiful to be present. For the first few years, they sent postcards. Paris, Toronto, New York. Wish you were here, sweetheart. The handwriting looked like a stranger's. Grandma pinned each one on the fridge anyway, as if love could be magnetized. When I was 4, I asked when they'd come home for good. They have big dreams, darling, Grandma said, tying my hair into a neat braid. But you have us, and that's what matters. Even then, I noticed the flicker in her smile, the sadness that hid behind gentleness. They visited twice a year if the stars aligned. Christmas and maybe my birthday. Diane would arrive in designer coats, reeking of Chanel and self-pity, kissing the air beside my cheek. Scott rarely came inside. He'd stay in the car with the engine running, pretending to take phone calls while Grandpa watched from the window, jaw tight. At 5, I stopped asking why. At 7, I stopped waiting at the window. At 10, I stopped calling them Mom and Dad when they visited. They didn't notice. The house itself became my world. Bookshelves heavy with law journals, the smell of cinnamon and tulips, the comforting rhythm of 2 people who actually showed up. Grandpa would kneel beside me at the kitchen table, helping with math problems, teaching me logic through chess. Always think 3 moves ahead, he said. In chess and in life. Grandma taught me patience through gardening. Some things only bloom when they're ready, she'd whisper. You can't rush growth. They never said a bad word about Diane and Scott, but silence can tell the truth louder than any accusation. When I was 8, I had a solo in the school Christmas concert, 3 small lines in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I spent weeks practicing. I scanned the crowd from the stage, searching for them. Grandma waved, clutching flowers. Grandpa held the old camcorder steady, but the 2 empty seats in the second row, labeled reserved for parents, stayed empty. That night I told Grandma I wasn't hungry. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear the garage door open. It never did. They wanted to come, sweetheart, Grandma said softly when she tucked me in, but I'd overheard her phone call earlier. Diane had said Scott's team was hosting a Christmas party. We can't miss it. People will talk. I didn't cry. I just turned away and said, it's okay. I had you. From then on, I measured love by presence, by who showed up, who stayed through the hard parts, who remembered without being reminded. When I turned 12, Diane brought me a tablet for Christmas. I already had one. Grandpa had given it to me months earlier for school. I tried to tell her. She waved a manicured hand. Then give one away. Share, darling. It's good for your soul. That was Diane in a sentence. Generous when it made her look generous. At 16, my classmates envied me for having a retired Supreme Court judge as a guardian. They thought it sounded elegant, intellectual. They didn't know how it felt to sign school forms under guardian instead of parent. They didn't know what it meant to see both parents' names on the birth certificate and realize they were just signatures, not people. Grandpa shielded me from most of it. He never complained, even when he worked late into his 70s to pay for my education. Raising you keeps me young, he'd joke. But sometimes I caught him staring at Diane's old photographs with that look, the one that said he was trying to understand where he went wrong. She made her choices. Grandma told him once when she thought I was asleep. But we've made ours too. We choose love. It took me years to understand what that meant. Love isn't DNA. It's not a shared last name or matching eyes. It's showing up when no one asks you to. It's changing diapers at 55 and attending every school event just to make sure a little girl never feels forgotten again. By the time I reached 18, my parents were strangers with familiar faces. But my grandparents, they were everything. My real family, my real story. And one day soon, they'd be the reason I learned to fight back. The older I grew, the more I realized that my grandparents' love wasn't loud. It was steady, like the hum of a well-kept house. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed day after day in the smallest gestures that built the foundation of who I became. Grandma Helen believed every morning deserved ceremony. She'd hum as she set out breakfast, Homemade jam, warm toast, tea with lemon. She claimed it was impossible to start a bad day with a good breakfast. Grandpa William, still wearing his robe from an early hearing, would sit across from me reading the New York Times, occasionally glancing over the top to quiz me on vocabulary words. "Define jurisdiction, Miss Blake," he'd say, half smiling. I grew up thinking every family discussed ethics over oatmeal. They raised me to value consistency, the kind of reliability my parents never learned. Sunday mornings were for church and chess. Sunday evenings were sacred dinners, no matter how tired Grandpa was or how busy I pretended to be as a teenager. He'd always say, "You can lose your case, Rowan, but never your integrity." When I was 10, I wanted to quit soccer because a coach benched me for missing practice. Grandpa refused to let me. "We don't quit because someone else underestimates us," he said, driving me to the next game himself. We proved them wrong by showing up. I played. We lost. But he cheered like we'd won the World Cup, clapping so loud at home. Grandma was the quiet heart of everything. She taught me patience by letting me help in the garden, even when I made a mess of it. I still remember the smell of soil on my hands, and the way she said, "Things grow when they're cared for, not when they're rushed." Years later, I realized she wasn't talking about plants. She was talking about every milestone became a family event. Report cards, debate competitions, science fairs. They were there, always there. When I won my first debate trophy, Grandpa treated it like I'd won the Nobel Prize. He even built a small shelf in the hallway for Rowan's victories, though it ended up filled with everything from ribbons to drawings to clumsy clay sculptures. Graham, they never spoiled me, not with money at least. They spoiled me with Prez. They showed up for every late-night meltdown, every failure, every heartbreak. When I failed my driving test the first time, I came home furious. Grandpa didn't scold me. He just handed me the car keys and said, "Drive me around the block until you don't feel like a failure anymore." I passed the next week. At school, people whispered about my old parents. They didn't understand. To me, youth was overrated. Stability wasn't. My friends envied my independence, but they didn't know the fear underneath. The quiet terror that someday I'd wake up and lose them too. When Grandma died suddenly from a stroke, that fear became real. I was 18, days away from leaving for college. The house, once full of laughter and warmth, fell silent overnight. Grandpa didn't cry where I could see, but I heard him one night in the kitchen, whispering to her photograph, "You kept us together, Helen." I almost deferred college, but he wouldn't let me. "You'll go," he insisted. "You'll make her proud." He hugged me tighter than he ever had and whispered, "You are the best thing she and I ever did right." From that day on, we were no longer just grandfather and granddaughter. We were partners in survival. Two people who had lost the same heart and refused to let grief take what remained. We built a new rhythm. Sunday dinners for two, laughter that returned slowly, and conversations that shaped my future. He taught me law like other grandfathers taught fishing. He showed me how to question, how to see truth beyond words, how to wield power without letting it consume me. By the time I graduated law school, I realized the truth. My grandparents hadn't just raised me. They'd rebuilt me. Every victory I'd ever have, every courtroom I'd stand in, would be the echo of their love. And when Grandpa later passed, that love didn't end. It simply turned into strength. Leaving for college felt like tearing out the final pages of a story that wasn't finished yet. Grandpa stood in the driveway as I loaded the car, his hands in the pockets of his worn blazer. The morning air carried the scent of tulips from Grandma's old garden, her last bloom before she died. "You'll do great things, Rowan," he said. "Just remember where you came from." "I will," I promised. He smiled, proud but fragile, as though letting me go meant reliving the loss of Helen all over again. Boston University was a world away from the quiet life we'd built. The campus buzzed with ambition, students chasing success like oxygen. I threw myself into it, determined to earn every sacrifice my grandparents had made. I studied political science, then pre-law, hungry for understanding, for control over a world that had once felt unpredictable. Every Sunday night, I called Grandpa. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we just sat in silence. The kind that only exists between two people who don't need to fill space to feel close. He'd ask, "Are you eating well?" And I'd lie, "Of course." He knew I was living on coffee and ramen. He pretended to believe me anyway. In sophomore year, he visited for family weekend. Most parents came in clusters, mothers with cameras, fathers with wallets. Grandpa arrived alone, carrying a single envelope. Inside was a letter from Grandma, written years before she died. "If you're reading this, it means you're doing what you were meant to do." Her handwriting slanted softly, her voice echoing through the paper. "Don't let fear make you small, Rowan. The world needs women with voices like yours." I didn't cry until he left. Law school came next. 3 brutal years that stripped everything soft from me. My classmates complained about the workload. I treated it like an oath. I worked part-time, studied full-time, and survived on determination and caffeine. I imagined Grandma watching, whispering, "Things grow when they're cared for," while Grandpa's voice echoed, "You can lose your case, but never your integrity." When graduation day arrived, Grandpa sat front row, his silver hair glinting under the auditorium lights. As I crossed the stage, he stood and clapped before anyone else. I could see tears glistening behind his glasses. Afterward, he hugged me so tightly I could feel the tremor in his hands. "Top of your class," he whispered proudly. "You did it, counselor. My parents didn't come. They sent a congratulatory text. Good job. We're proud of you." I didn't reply. By then, I'd stopped expecting anything from people who only showed up when it cost them nothing. With Grandpa's connections and my grades, I landed an internship at the district attorney's office. What started as paperwork turned into trial prep, then into assisting on real cases, financial crimes, corruption, embezzlement. I found my purpose there, not in winning, but in the pursuit of truth. The system was messy, often unfair, but it was still the best tool we had to keep the powerful accountable. Grandpa retired the year I became a full prosecutor. He was 82, and still sharper than most lawyers half his age. The retirement gala was filled with judges, attorneys, and politicians. When it was his turn to speak, he called me up to the podium. "This," he told the crowd, resting a proud hand on my shoulder, "is my greatest accomplishment. Not any ruling, not any case. Her." That moment changed everything. I'd always worked to make him proud. That night, I realized I already had. After his retirement, I started visiting more often. Every Sunday dinner continued, no exceptions. Sometimes I'd cook, sometimes we'd order takeout and debate legal ethics over Chinese noodles. He'd tell me stories about the cases that haunted him, the ones where justice wasn't clean, where morality blurred against the law. "The law is blind, Rowan," he'd say, "but people aren't. Our job is to keep both eyes open anyway." Those conversations shaped my career more than any textbook ever could. I climbed fast in the DA's office. Too fast, according to some. But I didn't care about politics. I cared about the work. By 30, I was handling high-profile corruption cases. People started calling me the ice prosecutor because I didn't flinch in the courtroom. I took it as a compliment. They didn't know how many nights I'd stayed up rereading files, afraid of missing something that could cost an innocent person their life. Through it all, Grandpa was there. Every victory phone call, every late-night visit when I fell asleep on his couch surrounded by case files. Sometimes I'd find him asleep in his recliner, too, both of us stubbornly working until exhaustion won. One evening, after a particularly draining case, I arrived at his house unannounced. He was sitting by the fire, reading one of Grandma's old gardening journals. He looked up and smiled softly. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine," I lied, sinking into the chair beside him. He studied me for a long moment. "You've got her eyes, you know. Helen's. They only softened when she looked at something she loved." I laughed lightly. "You mean your garden?" He shook his head. "I mean you." That night he told me something I'll never forget. "Raising you was the greatest privilege of my life," he said. "I got to be a father twice." The second time I actually got it right. I wanted to tell him that he'd saved me, that he'd given me everything my parents never could, structure, purpose, belonging. But my throat tightened, and the words stuck somewhere between love and fear. Instead, I said, You and Grandma gave me everything. You built me from the ground up." He smiled. "We just gave you roots, Rowan. You're the one who grew." That was Grandpa, always deflecting credit, always pushing me to stand taller on my own. When he turned 87, his health began to fade. Nothing dramatic, just the slow, inevitable decline of time. But even then, he never missed a Sunday dinner. I started bringing meals to him instead. He'd tease me for over-seasoning the soup, then secretly finish every drop. The last conversation we had before he passed wasn't about death. It was about duty. "Promise me," he said quietly, "that you'll use what you've learned for good. That you won't let the world make you cynical." "I promise," I said. "Good," he whispered, eyes closing briefly. "Then I can rest." He died peacefully in his sleep a few months later, leaving behind more than memories. He left me a legacy, a blueprint for living with integrity. I thought his death would shatter me. Instead, it solidified something. His voice lived in my conscience, guiding me through every courtroom, every decision. And when the will was finally read, the one that changed everything, it didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a final lesson that love isn't proven through words. It's proven through showing up, again and again, until the end. And that's exactly what Grandpa did. The morning Grandpa died, the world felt too still, like the air itself was holding its breath. It was a Sunday, and I'd baked his favorite blueberry scones. I remember humming to the radio on my drive over, thinking about how he'd tease me for burning the edges again. When I pulled into the driveway, the lights inside were still off. The front door was unlocked. He was in his armchair, book open on his lap, glasses still perched on his nose. Peaceful. Too peaceful. For a moment, I thought he was asleep, but the silence told me otherwise. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry right away. I just knelt beside him, held his cold hand, and whispered, "You kept your promise, Grandpa. You showed up until the very end." The days that followed blurred together. Funeral arrangements, condolences from people who had barely known him, polite words from colleagues who saw him as an institution instead of a person. But when I stood at the podium to give his eulogy, I spoke as his granddaughter, not his successor. He didn't just raise me, I told the packed courtroom filled with judges, lawyers, and politicians. He taught me what justice means outside of law books, showing up for people when no one else will. My parents arrived late and sat in the last row. They left before the reception. Typical Diane and Scott. They hadn't seen him in years, but somehow their absence still managed to hurt. A week later, I received a call from his estate attorney, Ms. Margaret Chen. "Rowan," she said gently, "your grandfather left detailed instructions. He wanted you to come alone." When I arrived, she handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in his precise handwriting. Inside was a letter and a legal document, the will. "My dearest Rowan," it began. "If you're reading this, it means my time has come. But don't grieve for me, my girl. My greatest joy was watching you grow into everything your grandmother and I dreamed you'd be. I leave you everything not because of blood, but because of presence. You earned it, not through obligation, but through love." My throat tightened as I read the last line. Be strong, and never apologize for being the one who stayed. The will left everything to me. His house, investments, life insurance, nearly $3 million. But the shock wasn't the inheritance itself. It was the second envelope Ms. Chen handed me. "Your grandfather wanted transparency," she explained. Inside were decades of bank statements, proof that he had sent Diane $3,000 a month since I was born. More than $800,000 in total. Accompanying the statements were printed emails and texts from Diane asking for a little extra, promising to visit, then canceling at the last minute. "He anticipated they might contest the will," Ms. Chen said softly. "He wanted you to have evidence. He wanted you protected." I sat in her office long after she left, reading his words again and again. Love wasn't about biology. It was about showing up, and he'd proven it in both life and death. But as I folded the letter back into its envelope, a cold certainty settled over me. Diane and Scott wouldn't take this quietly, and when they came for what wasn't theirs, they would learn exactly who their daughter had become. It didn't take long. Barely a month after the funeral, I got the call. "Rowan," my attorney, Thomas Goldstein, said, his voice steady but edged with irritation, "your parents have filed a petition to contest the will." I didn't even pretend to be surprised. "On what grounds?" "Undue influence. Mental incompetence. They're claiming you manipulated your grandfather into disinheriting them." I actually laughed. Short, sharp, hollow. They couldn't even bother to visit him when he was alive. "Now suddenly they care?" Thomas sighed. "People like your parents don't grieve. They calculate, and they see 3 million reasons to rewrite history." He was right. That evening I drove to Grandpa's house, the house that was now legally mine but still smelled like his aftershave and the lemon polish Grandma used on the banister. I walked room to room, trying to imagine how anyone could call this manipulation. Every corner told the truth. Framed debate ribbons, photos of Sunday dinners, his handwriting in the margins of my old law textbooks. Love lived here. Not deceit, but my parents didn't see love. They saw loss, of control, of narrative, of money. The lawsuit hit the local papers within a week. Prominent judge's daughter sues granddaughter over $3 million estate. Reporters loved the irony. I ignored the headlines, but my coworkers whispered behind my back, unsure how to approach me. The prosecutor's office doesn't prepare you for personal scandals. Thomas called me in to review their filings. Diane's affidavit read like a tragic novel. My father was a brilliant man, but after my mother's death, he became isolated. Rowan took advantage of his grief, positioning herself as his caretaker, limiting my access to him. I loved my father dearly and would have been there if not for her interference. It was fiction. Elegant, polished, and utterly false. Scott's statement was worse. 2 paragraphs of indifference followed by a demand for equitable distribution of family assets. Thomas pushed the papers toward me. "We'll fight it. But I want you prepared. This will get ugly." I looked him in the eye. I've prosecuted corporate sharks, politicians, and men who thought laws didn't apply to them. They're my parents, not gods. The hearing was set for the following month. Coincidentally, or maybe fatefully, it landed on a Friday. The same weekday Grandpa and I had always met for dinner. When I entered the courtroom that morning, my mother was already there, dressed like grief incarnate. Black dress, minimal makeup, pearls she never earned. Scott sat beside her, fidgeting with his phone, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Then the judge walked in. And the universe, it seemed, still had a sense of poetry. Judge Marcus Brennan, my grandfather's former clerk from 20 years ago. A man I'd met once at Grandpa's retirement gala. He recognized me immediately. I could see it in his eyes. A flicker of memory, followed by quiet respect. After formalities, he addressed the room. "For transparency, I clerked for the late Justice William Parker 2 decades ago. If either party objects to my presiding, speak now." My mother's lawyer, a polished man named Richard Palmer, leaned in to whisper to her. Diane hesitated, then shook her head. "No objection, Your Honor." Big mistake. The trial began with Palmer's opening statement. His voice dripped with false sincerity. This is a story of a devoted daughter cruelly separated from her loving father by manipulation and deceit. He gestured toward me. The defendant, Ms. Rowan Blake, took advantage of a grieving old man's vulnerability, isolating him from his only child to secure his estate. I sat motionless, pen steady in hand. I'd spent years learning to keep my face neutral, while criminals lied under oath. This was no different, except the liar was my own mother. When Palmer finished, Thomas stood, calm, confident, surgical. "Your Honor, this case is not about manipulation. It's about presence. For 32 years, Ms. Blake showed up. The plaintiffs did not. The evidence will show that Judge Parker left his estate to the person who earned it. Through love, through loyalty, and through a lifetime of showing up when no one else did." Judge Brennan nodded. "Proceed." As the first witness was called, I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She looked almost smug, like she believed her performance would win sympathy. But she'd forgotten who taught me how to read people. Grandpa had warned me long ago. Some battles you don't choose. "Rowan, They choose you. But when they do, you fight with facts, not fury. And as I watched Diane raise her right hand to swear the oath, I knew this was exactly the battle he had prepared me for, because this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about truth, and this time I intended to win, exactly the way he taught me to. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tension. Every eye followed my mother as she adjusted her black dress and dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue she'd brought specifically for the performance. "Mrs. Blake," Palmer began gently, "describe your relationship with your father," she sniffled theatrically. "He was everything to me, my hero. After my mother died, he changed. He became distant, cold. Rowan took advantage of that. She made him believe I didn't care." I clenched my jaw. The lies rolled so easily off her tongue. For a woman who rarely showed up, she'd become an expert at acting like the victim. Palmer continued, "And when did you realize your father had left you nothing in his will?" "After the funeral," she said, voice breaking. I was devastated. I didn't care about money. I just wanted to feel loved again. The irony nearly made me laugh. When Thomas rose for cross-examination, the air shifted. His tone was calm, deliberate. "Mrs. Blake, you were 18 when Rowan was born, correct?" "Yes." "And you voluntarily left her with your parents when she was 3 months old?" Yes, but that was temporary." He nodded, flipping through a binder. "According to your father's calendar, you visited 4 times in her first year. Then, on average, twice a year after that. Does that sound right?" She hesitated. "I was busy. I had responsibilities." Thomas's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. Responsibilities like shopping trips in Paris and ski vacations in Aspen. Her face stiffened. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. He continued, "Mrs. Blake, your father sent you $3,000 a month for over 20 years, more than $800,000 total. Did you use that money to support your daughter?" She froze. I don't recall." "Allow me to refresh your memory." Thomas held up a stack of bank statements. "These transfers coincide with luxury purchases, jewelry, resorts, cars, none of it for Rowan." My mother's silence was answer enough. Thomas stepped closer, voice firm. "So you weren't excluded from your father's life, Mrs. Blake. You excluded yourself. Isn't that true?" Her lips trembled. He pushed me away. "No," Thomas said quietly. "He just stopped paying extra." Judge Brennan's pen stopped moving. The silence in the room felt heavy, final. For the first time, my mother didn't have a script. And I realized that this moment of truth, was what Grandpa had prepared me for all along. When Thomas called me to the stand, my hands were steady, but my heart felt like thunder behind my ribs. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, and took my seat. For a moment, I glanced toward Judge Brennan. His expression was calm, but I could sense recognition in his eyes. The look of a man who had once admired my grandfather and now wanted to see his legacy defended with dignity. "Ms. Blake," Thomas began, his tone soft, almost protective. "Tell the court about your upbringing." I took a breath. I was born when my mother was 18. 3 months later, she and my father decided parenthood didn't fit their plans. They dropped me off at my grandparents' home, saying it would be temporary. It wasn't. A murmur swept through the audience. I continued. "My grandparents, William and Helen Parker, raised me. They gave me everything: love, stability, and a sense of belonging. My parents, on the other hand, were visitors. They'd show up twice a year, sometimes less. My father usually stayed in the car." Thomas nodded. "Did your grandparents ever prevent your parents from seeing you?" "No," I said firmly. "They never spoke badly about them. They always hoped my parents would come around. Grandma used to say, 'Everyone has their own timeline for growing up.' But mine never did. I told the court about the small moments, the ones that mattered. My first school play, Grandma in the front row with flowers from her garden, Grandpa filming every second, my parents' seats empty. My 7th birthday, Grandma baked a cake with 7 layers because she said I deserved a big celebration. My mother called halfway through, said she forgot. As I spoke, the courtroom grew quiet. Even Palmer stopped flipping through his notes. "Did your grandparents support your education?" Thomas asked. "Completely. Grandpa helped me with homework, taught me logic and ethics through chess. Grandma taught me patience through gardening. They taught me that love isn't something you buy. It's something you show, over and over again. And your parents? They sent gifts, expensive, impersonal things. A tablet I didn't need, designer shoes that didn't fit. It wasn't love. It was guilt dressed as generosity. Thomas let the silence linger. Ms. Blake, how did your grandparents' support shape who you are today? I swallowed hard. Everything I've achieved is because of them. I became a prosecutor because my grandfather taught me that justice means showing up for those who can't fight for themselves. My grandmother taught me empathy, that power means nothing without compassion. They weren't just my guardians. They were my parents in every way that mattered. When Thomas finished, he gave me a reassuring nod and stepped back. Palmer rose for cross-examination, straightening his tie like he was stepping into a performance. Ms. Blake, he began, you paint a touching picture, but isn't it true that you benefited financially from your grandfather? He paid for your schooling, your housing, your lifestyle. I met his gaze evenly. Yes, because he chose to. The same way he gave my mother $800,000 she never used for me. The difference is I gave him something back. Time, respect, love. He didn't just write checks to me. He shared his life with me, Palmer smirked. You expect the court to believe you had no idea he'd leave you his estate. I never asked, I said quietly. Because I didn't love him for what he had. I loved him for who he was. There was a long pause. Palmer tried to press again, his voice sharper. Ms. Blake, isn't it possible you isolated your grandfather from his daughter? No, I said. She isolated herself. My grandfather didn't need convincing to see the truth. He lived it every day for 32 years. The courtroom fell still again. I could feel every eye on me. Sympathy, curiosity, disbelief. Judge Brennan cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Blake. You may step down. As I walked back to my seat, I caught a glimpse of my mother. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. For the first time, she wasn't crying for sympathy. She was crying because she'd lost control of the story. And as I sat down beside Thomas, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a trial about inheritance. It was a reckoning. A lifetime of truth finally spoken out loud. After the trial recess that day, as I sat outside the courthouse beneath the pale sunlight, I thought of Grandpa's voice, steady, measured, filled with faith in me. The law is only as just as the people who uphold it. Rowan, he'd been right. That single belief had carried me from the quiet nights in his study to the roaring tension of a courtroom filled with lies and entitlement. Long before my parents tried to rewrite our family's history, I had already learned how to fight for truth, because he had trained me to. When I first joined the prosecutor's office, I was the youngest attorney on staff, barely 25 and far too idealistic. My colleagues called me the machine because I refused to take lunch breaks and never missed a filing deadline. I didn't care about popularity. I cared about precision. I wanted to be the kind of lawyer Grandpa would have respected, a servant of justice, not ego. The first case I ever won was a minor fraud charge, but it felt monumental. I could still see Grandpa's proud smile when I told him. You found your place, he said. Now use it wisely, and I did. I buried myself in cases others didn't want. White-collar crime, corruption, people with too much money and not enough conscience. I'd work late, drive home with my car full of evidence files, and fall asleep on the couch surrounded by paper. The work was exhausting, consuming, but it made sense. For once, life followed rules I could argue, defend, and prove. Each Sunday, I visited Grandpa without fail. Sometimes we debated cases. Other times we just sat in silence with the TV humming in the background. He'd pour coffee into 2 chipped mugs and say, always remember, justice isn't about vengeance. Rowan. It's about accountability. Those words became my creed. By 30, I'd become one of the top prosecutors in the state, handling high-profile corruption cases that landed on front pages. Reporters loved calling me the ice prosecutor, a woman too composed to be shaken, too sharp to be manipulated. They didn't understand that my calm wasn't coldness. It was control, a survival mechanism I'd learned from years of being the only adult in a house full of absence. But even as I built my reputation, I never lost sight of where it began. at that kitchen table where Grandpa taught me chess, logic, and the ethics of never compromising truth for convenience. He'd given me a legacy long before he gave me an inheritance, and every time I stood in court, facing down men twice my age who thought power excused corruption, I remembered him sitting in that old armchair, his voice echoing like a promise. One day you'll stand where I stood, and when you do, make sure the law remembers your name for the right reasons. I didn't know it yet, but the day would come when I'd have to defend not just the law, but his name itself. The second week of the trial began under a heavy gray sky, as if even the weather understood what kind of reckoning was about to unfold. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, their pens twitching for scandal. My parents, dressed in their expensive sorrow, sat at the plaintiff's table surrounded by papers they barely understood. Judge Brennan entered with quiet authority. "Let's proceed," he said. Diane was called first again. Palmer guided her through another round of practiced grief. "Your father was ill when he changed the will, wasn't he?" She clasped her hands dramatically. "Yes, he was lonely, vulnerable. Rowan kept him isolated." Thomas rose slowly. "Your Honor, permission to approach." He held up a folder. "These are visitor logs from Judge Parker's retirement community. Every week, every month. The only consistent visitor was Ms. Blake. Mrs. Blake's name appears 3 times. In 20 years. A low gasp rippled through the audience. "Mrs. Blake?" Thomas continued evenly. "Do you recognize your signature on these gift receipts? Handbags, luxury trips, $4,000 dinner tabs, all funded by your father's monthly transfers?" She froze, caught between vanity and guilt. He insisted on helping. Thomas's tone softened, cutting deeper. "He helped you for decades, and when he finally chose to help the person who helped him, you called it manipulation?" Judge Brennan raised a brow. "Answer the question, Mrs. Blake." Her voice cracked. "I just wanted what's fair." "Fair," Thomas echoed. "Or familiar?" When she couldn't reply, he nodded toward the bench. No further questions. Next came Scott. My father looked uncomfortable even swearing the oath. Palmer prompted him gently. "Mr. Blake, describe your relationship with Judge Parker." Scott scratched the back of his neck. "We weren't close. He didn't like me much." Thomas didn't bother standing. "No questions," he said, the silence damning enough. When it was my turn, I didn't speak with anger. I spoke with precision. I told the court about Grandpa's habits, his detailed records, his clarity of mind, his sharp humor even at 87. He wasn't confused, I said. He was consistent, and he made his choice out of love, not manipulation. When I finished, Judge Brennan folded his hands, studying me for a long moment. "Thank you, Ms. Blake," he said quietly. "That will be all." And for the first time since the trial began, I felt the tide begin to turn. The bailiff called my name again, and for the first time in weeks, the room fell absolutely still. I walked to the witness stand, every step measured, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in my ears. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now. Not hostile, just expectant. Judge Brennan's voice was calm. "Ms. Blake, you may proceed." Thomas gave me a nod, his expression unreadable. This was the moment, the one everything had been building toward. I took a breath and began. "My name is Rowan Blake," I said, voice steady. "I am 32 years old, a state prosecutor, and the granddaughter of the late Justice William Parker. But more importantly, I am the woman he raised after his daughter, my mother, chose not to." I glanced at Diane. She shifted uncomfortably, but I didn't look away. My grandparents took me in when I was 3 months old. They didn't do it out of obligation. They did it out of love. My grandmother taught me kindness. My grandfather taught me justice. Together, they taught me that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up when you need them. Thomas stepped closer. "Ms. Blake, the plaintiffs allege that you manipulated your grandfather into changing his will." "Did you?" "No," I said firmly. "I didn't need to. My grandfather was one of the sharpest minds in the state until the day he died. He reviewed contracts, wrote essays, even advised younger judges. The last year of his life, he proofread my case briefs for fun. That's not confusion. That's clarity. A faint murmur spread across the courtroom. Did your grandfather ever express regret for his decision to leave you his estate? Thomas asked. I smiled faintly. Only that he couldn't take it with him to make sure I'd eat something besides coffee. The gallery chuckled softly. Then I sobered. He told me once, I gave your mother money. I gave you time. Now I know which gift mattered more. Thomas nodded. One final question. What would you say to the claim that you isolated your grandfather from your mother? I looked directly at Diane. Isolation is when you stop calling, when you skip birthdays, when you let someone else raise your child and only remember them when there's money on the table. My voice didn't tremble. He didn't shut her out. She walked out, and every time she had a chance to walk back in, she didn't. A long silence filled the room. Even the reporters stopped scribbling. Judge Brennan leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Ms. Blake, do you believe your grandfather would stand by his decision today? I met his gaze. Absolutely, Your Honor. Because he always believed in rewarding loyalty, not entitlement. When I stepped down from the stand, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. Not triumph, not relief, just peace. For the first time since this trial began, the truth had finally been spoken out loud, and it no longer belonged to anyone else's version of the story. It was mine. The next morning, the courtroom was overflowing, every seat filled, cameras flashing through the glass doors. It felt like the whole city had come to witness the end of the Blake family's spectacle. I sat beside Thomas, my palms pressed flat against the cool wood of the defense table. Across from me, Diane dabbed her eyes with a crumpled tissue, while Scott stared blankly ahead, arms crossed like he was waiting for a penalty call in a game he'd already lost. Judge Brennan entered promptly at 9. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. After careful review of testimony, evidence, and witness accounts, he began. This court finds that Justice William Parker's will reflects his true and deliberate intentions. The air thickened. Diane's breath caught. There is no evidence of undue influence, nor of mental incompetence, the judge continued, voice calm but resolute. The documentation shows that Judge Parker was of sound mind, meticulous, and fully aware of his choices. The will stands as written. I exhaled, finally, but then came the final blow. Furthermore, the court orders the plaintiffs to bear all legal costs incurred by the defense, as this lawsuit was brought forth without sufficient merit. The gavel struck once more. This case is closed. The murmurs erupted instantly, reporters scribbling, the audience whispering, the sharp clack of cameras snapping. But all I could hear was the echo of Grandpa's voice in my memory. Justice is truth, spoken out loud. Diane's face went pale, her shoulders trembling as she turned toward me. Rowan, please, she whispered, stepping closer as the crowd began to disperse. You don't understand. I stood, my voice quiet but firm. You wanted what you always wanted, something for nothing. Her tears streaked down like rain. I'm your mother, I shook my head slowly. No, you're the woman who gave birth to me. A mother is someone who stays, who shows up, who sacrifices. You haven't done any of those things in 32 years. Scott stood beside her, muttering, This is ridiculous. It was family money. Family, I repeated, meeting his eyes. Then maybe you should have acted like family. For a moment, silence hung between us, thick with every missed birthday, every broken promise, every dollar they took, and every moment they ignored. Finally, I stepped back. Don't contact me again. Not about money, not about guilt. We're done. Diane reached for me, her voice breaking. Rowan, please. I stepped away before she could touch me. Grandpa was right, I said softly. You made your choice a long time ago. Today the court just confirmed it. And with that, I turned and walked out of the courtroom. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. But I didn't look back. For the first time, I wasn't the abandoned child or the defendant fighting to prove herself. I was the victor, and the heir to a legacy built on love, truth, and the courage to let go. The courthouse doors closed behind me, and for the first time in months, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. Thomas offered a small smile. It's over, Rowan. He'd be proud. I nodded, though words still sat like stones in my throat. He already knew I'd win, I said softly. He prepared me for this. The weeks that followed were quiet. I returned to work, to my routine, to a life that finally belonged to me. The inheritance remained untouched in a trust. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about keeping his promise alive. Then one morning, the doorbell rang. Standing outside was an older woman clutching a large, worn envelope. "You must be Rowan," she said with a kind smile. "I'm Patricia Caldwell, your grandfather's neighbor. I helped him sort through his papers before he passed. He asked me to keep this safe." Inside were dozens of letters, handwritten in Grandpa's familiar, precise script. The first one began simply, "Dear Diane, I keep writing though I know you'll never reply." Each letter was a record of hope and heartbreak, pleas for her to visit, to call, to remember the family she'd left behind. He wrote about my milestones, my first soccer goal, my high school debate trophy, my law school graduation. In every letter, he told her she was missing moments she'd never get back. But near the end, one line stood apart. "You gave me Rowan, and in doing so, you gave me a reason to live after Helen died. I only wish you understood that love isn't measured in money. It's measured in presence." By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the ink. He hadn't written those letters for her. He'd written them for me, to prove that even in his disappointment, his love had never wavered. I kept Grandpa's letters in a cedar box on my desk, a quiet reminder that love leaves behind evidence just as strong as any case file. Reading them changed something in me. For years, I had defined myself as the child who survived abandonment, the granddaughter who defended a legacy. But now, I saw what Grandpa had always seen, a woman ready to build her own. 6 months after the verdict, my life found a steady rhythm again. Early mornings, long hours at the prosecutor's office, Sunday dinners alone but peaceful. Justice had been served, and for once I didn't need to fight anymore. That peace, though fragile, was enough. Then came the call that would alter everything. "Ms. Blake," the voice on the line said, "this is the governor's office. We're offering you a judicial appointment. County court. Your record speaks for itself." I froze, the weight of those words settling in like destiny fulfilled. My voice shook only slightly when I replied, "I accept." The months that followed were a blur of vetting, hearings, and headlines. Reporters dredged up the lawsuit, the inheritance, the family scandal. Some accused me of bias. Others called me a symbol of integrity. I ignored the noise. I'd learned long ago that truth doesn't need defending. It just needs consistency. On the day of my swearing in, I wore Grandpa's old judicial pin on my lapel, the one engraved with Veritas et Fides, truth and faith. As I raised my hand and took the oath, I could almost feel him there beside me, the faint scent of his aftershave, the quiet confidence in his eyes. When the ceremony ended, a reporter asked, "Judge Blake, do you believe this appointment honors your grandfather's legacy?" I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "It continues it." That night, as I sat alone in my new chambers, I placed the cedar box of letters on the bookshelf beside his framed photograph. The title didn't make me powerful. It made me responsible. For every child who'd been forgotten. For every parent who had failed to show up. For every person who thought love was something that could be bought. I wasn't just his granddaughter anymore. I was proof that legacy isn't inherited. It's earned. 3 years into my judgeship, the rhythm of the courtroom had become second nature. Rulings, hearings, mediations. I handled everything from fraud cases to custody disputes, always guided by one principle. Actions mattered more than blood. It wasn't just something Grandpa taught me. It was the truth I had lived. Then one autumn morning, my clerk entered with an envelope stamped with the state seal. "It's from the governor's office," she said, trying to hide a smile. Inside was a single sentence that made my heart stop. "You have been nominated for the state Supreme Court." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That seat, that specific seat, had once belonged to my grandfather, Justice William Parker. Decades ago, I'd sat in the gallery as a little girl, watching him preside with that calm authority, his voice measured and unshakable. I remembered thinking, I want to be like him. Now, I was about to inherit not just his chamber, but his legacy. The confirmation process was brutal. Reporters revived the inheritance trial, splashing headlines about the prosecutor who inherited millions. Critics claimed my family history made me too emotionally biased. But when the committee asked for my response during the hearing, I met their gaze and said, "Bias is pretending blood equals love. Experience is knowing it doesn't. I judge based on evidence, not expectation." The room went silent. A few nodded. One senator whispered, "That's exactly what we need." Weeks later, the call came. "Congratulations, Justice Blake," the governor said. "You've made history. The youngest Supreme Court appointee in state history." On the day I took the bench, I wore Grandpa's robe, restored, pressed, still faintly smelling of cedar and thyme. It was slightly too big in the shoulders, but I didn't care. As I adjusted the collar, I whispered, "We made it, Grandpa." My first case was a bitter estate dispute, adult children suing their late father's caregiver. The irony wasn't lost on me. As testimony unfolded, I saw echoes of my own past, the greed, the entitlement, the aching absence of real love. When I delivered the ruling, my voice was steady. Family is not a biological guarantee of goodness. It is a pattern of presence, care, and consistency. The law recognizes not who shares your blood, but who shows up for your life. That decision made headlines across the country. Commentators called it the Blake Doctrine. Law schools cited it. Judges quoted it. But for me, it was simpler than all that. It was a promise kept to a man who had believed that justice and love were never separate things. That night, I stood alone in my new chambers, looking out at the city lights glowing beyond the marble columns. My reflection stared back, older, steadier, wearing his robe. I smiled and whispered to the empty room, "You were right, Grandpa. Legacy isn't money or reputation. It's what we leave inside the people we love." Years passed like chapters in a long, steady novel. The title on my office door changed, from Judge Blake to Justice Rowan Blake, but the mission never did. Each decision, each opinion I wrote, carried the invisible imprint of my grandparents' lessons. I didn't just interpret the law. I tried to humanize it, the way Grandpa once told me justice should always be firm, but never cold. Under my tenure, the Supreme Court adopted reforms to protect elderly citizens from financial abuse and to redefine parental responsibility. Reporters said I'd reshaped the moral backbone of family law. I smiled when I read that, because what they didn't know was that every reform, every statute was born from memories of Sunday dinners and tulip gardens, not from textbooks. But the truest measure of legacy isn't in accolades. It's in the people who carry your principles forward. Each spring, I taught a guest seminar at the law school where I once studied. My first lecture always began the same way. Family isn't blood. It's the people who choose you and the ones you choose back. Students would lean in, pens ready, expecting a legal maxim. Instead, I told them about Grandpa and Grandma, the two people who saved me from neglect and taught me that love was a daily decision. And then I'd end with the same message every year. The law can't make people good, but it can protect those who are. By the time I reached my 60s, the world called me a pioneer. I called myself fortunate to have been loved, to have been taught by giants who showed me how to stand tall without arrogance, and to have lived a life that honored their sacrifices. On the 30th anniversary of Grandpa's passing, the state unveiled the William Parker Justice Center. I was asked to give the keynote address. Standing at the podium beneath his portrait, I felt the years fold in on themselves. Me at 6 years old on his lap, me at 32 defending his name, me now, gray at the temples, standing in the very place he once dreamed I'd reach. Justice Parker taught me that truth has to outlive us, I told the audience. That real inheritance isn't money, it's integrity, compassion, and courage. As the crowd rose in applause, I looked up at his portrait and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa, together." That evening, alone in my chambers, I opened the cedar box one last time. Inside were his letters, my law school photo, and the note he left me. "You earned this." Tears blurred the ink, but my heart was light. Because legacy wasn't just what I carried, It was what I had become. And as the city lights shimmered beyond the courthouse windows, I realized that love, like justice, never dies. It simply passes the torch. The night of my retirement banquet, the city skyline glittered outside the grand windows of the William Parker Justice Center, the building that now carried my grandfather's name. I stood at the edge of the crowd, champagne in hand, listening to speeches about Justice Rowan Blake's integrity, her legacy of compassion, and her lifetime of service. But my thoughts drifted far away to a small kitchen smelling of tulips and cinnamon cookies, to the sound of my grandfather's voice teaching me that doing what's right would never be easy, but it would always be worth it. When it was my turn to speak, the hall grew quiet. I stepped up to the podium and looked out at the faces before me. Colleagues, students, young lawyers I'd mentored. I've spent my life in courtrooms, I began. Rooms filled with conflict, fear, and hope. I've seen the best and worst of people. But what I learned has nothing to do with legal codes. It's simpler than that. I paused, feeling my throat tighten. Family isn't defined by the people who share your DNA. It's defined by the people who choose to stay when life gets inconvenient. Love isn't spoken, it's shown. Justice isn't a verdict. It's a way of living. I glanced at the front row, where a group of students sat together, the next generation, ready to fight their own battles for truth. My grandparents didn't just raise me, I continued. They rescued me. From neglect, from loneliness, from the belief that I was unworthy. Everything I've become was built on their love and on their example of what real family means. Presence, not possession. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but I barely heard it. My eyes found the portrait of Grandpa on the far wall, his expression wise and steady as ever. When the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, I walked outside alone. The night air was cool, the courthouse steps glowing softly under the streetlights. I whispered into the quiet. I kept my promise. I honored you, both of you. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was carrying their legacy. I was their legacy. As I turned to leave, the faint scent of tulips drifted through the air. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was something more. But I smiled anyway, because I knew they were still with me, in every decision I made. In every life I touched, in every truth I defended, love, after all, is eternal. Lesson for the listener. Family is not about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up for your life. Love is proven through presence, not promises. And the truest legacy you can ever leave behind isn't wealth, power, or fame. It's integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand for what's right, even when you stand alone.